The Peace. Author's Foreword. The essay Peace was sketched out in its basic outlines in the winter of 1941, and was ready in its present form in the summer of 1943. In the meantime, the situation has changed drastically, but unchanged are the curative means which alone can heal Europe, and beyond it, the world. It is an obligation for me to thank the readers of the manuscript for the care with which they kept the secret, many of them in spite of all the horrors of imprisonment. Especially I think of General von Stulpnagel, that knightly man under whose protection the essay came about. This work is to be dedicated to my son, Ernst Jünger. He also had known it, after he had proved himself, almost still a boy, in the resistance to the internal tyranny and had languished in its prisons. He fell on the 29th of November 1944, at 18 years, for his homeland in the Marble Mountains near Carrara. In the same way have the best of all nations not spared themselves. Their sacrifice and the sorrow they left behind will be fruitful. E.J. Introduction. It is high time that the moral insanity which gripped America during and after the war concerning all things German, that raving frenzy of hatred so assiduously fostered by the Emil Ludwigs, the Morgenthaus, and Vansittars, gives way to a rational attitude toward what is called, somewhat condescendingly, the German problem. Modern man has a fatal propensity for attempting to free himself of his own feelings of guilt, his own anxieties and terrors, by projecting them onto some scapegoat, some incarnation of absolute evil, which he burdens with all the sins, all the shortcomings that he cannot face within himself. The Jews were made to assume this burden for the Nazis. For the addicts to the Stalin myth, the Trotskyites are the scapegoat. And for many an otherwise liberal and normal American, this role has of late been assigned to the German, a sort of corporate entity, an amalgamation of all that is hateful and despicable. Those whose concern is with a more rational ordering of world affairs and of the body politic, whose concern is the saving of individual and collective morality from a zoological irrationalism, which thinks in terms of species instead of human beings, are under the obligation to tear down the wall of hatred and distrust that now surrounds Germany, and makes of it a sort of insane asylum and prison house combined. We must penetrate behind the facade which propagandists have built to discover the individual German, a person, neither good nor bad, but a human being with both potentialities, who will, in part, be shaped by the very way we act toward him. Once we have freed ourselves from a magic thinking, which attributes reality to metaphors such as race or national character, we begin to enter the realm of morality. Morality and rational thinking cannot be divorced. The book which I have the honor to introduce to the American public can be of immense aid in this endeavor toward understanding. Ernst Jünger is not one of those good people whose goodness is somewhat boring in its monotony. In his own life, on the contrary, he has lived through and even savored the whole gamut of multifarious experiences that have assailed and tempted the German intellectual during the last 3 decades. Perhaps those who have themselves descended deeply into the abyss can report more from their descent than the simple spectator who has never but walked its edge. Ernst Jünger never was a Nazi, yet he was in the ranks of the most extreme German nationalists. He was one of the prophets of that nihilism which has contributed not a little to the demoralization and the cynical contempt for values which characterize large parts of the young German generation of pre-Hitler days. Yet Jünger, once he realized the fruits of that nihilistic spirit, which he himself was not innocent of having brought into being, revolted and turned away in disgust and shame. In 1939, shortly after the outbreak of the war, he wrote On the Marble Cliffs, the only great anti-Nazi novel to appear in Germany during Hitler's reign. A few years later, he wrote The Peace. This short book dates from the last phase of the Nazi terror, when Jünger was actively in contact with the men of the conservative opposition that made the attempt on the tyrant's life on July 20th, 1944. These men, who showed to a world that had not listened to the earlier mute testimony of illegal resistors who paid for their heroism with concentration camp and gallows, that there still existed German men willing to stake their lives in the cause of freedom, found in Jünger their spokesman and their herald. The Peace is the most impressive document from within Nazi Germany, testifying to the spirit and the reality of the other Germany. Junger's past does add rather than detract from this value. It is of almost symbolic significance that one who once sang paeans in honor of the warrior, who once rejoiced in the end of individuality, who praised the advent of a new total society in which things of steel, cold mathematical formulas, would pitilessly push aside all human and humane considerations, could now write an essay which starts with a quotation from Spinoza. The hatred, which is completely conquered by love, becomes love, and such love is stronger than it would have been had hatred not preceded it. The piece represents Junger's definite break with the values of his past, a balance sheet and a farewell, as well as a vision of things to come. I do not know any more poignant denunciation, in German or in any other language for that matter, of the evil that was Nazism, than the first pages of this book. These denunciatory pages, full of tragic beauty and passion, will stand as the most succinct and yet most adequate description of what the barbarians from within had done to a Germany they had conquered by force and by cunning. The second part of the book, The Fruit, presents an outline of a positive program to save Germany, more Europe, more Western civilization. The one-time herald of German nationalism now has understood that if Germany is not to become a country without history, no longer able to control her own destiny, she can be saved only through a common European effort. The European cultural tradition is by no means homogeneous, though there exist certain basic and vital common concepts. Jünger knows that the great cultural achievements of Europe are, in part, precisely based on the variety and diversity of national arts, of languages, laws, and mores. He loves the many hued shades of the European tradition. There cannot be too many colors on the palette. But he also recognizes that Europe will not be able to survive if she is not unified economically and technically. The hoarding of resources by each nation, the customs barriers, the trade quotas and restrictions that make of each nation an entity jealous of its prerogatives, can but lead to the collective suicide of Europe. Economic autarky in the age of supranational planning can but lead to death from suffocation. Only if Europe becomes a united and unified economic whole can there be hope for its future, for even mere survival. These ideas are not new. They have been stated before in more elaborate detail, yet they acquire poignancy for being expressed by Jünger in 1943, in the midst of war, at a time when Nazism still held the major part of Europe under its sway. Already then, Jünger knew what most Americans slowly are learning only now, that there is no longer a German problem, but only a European problem, which, moreover, cannot be solved but by co-equal participation of Germany in the work of general reconstruction. He knew that the rules and usages of warfare must find no place, must not be perpetuated in the peace. If such were the case, it would be a mere illusion of peace, under which the struggle would continue, at first invisibly, as civil war and foreign oppression, and then openly in new blocks of power. This insight of 1943 has not lost its significance in 1948. The intervening years of folly only add to its peculiar topical relevance. There is much talk at this stage of the reconstruction of Europe, yet one feels only too often that those who but recently have been converted to a European doctrine have been impelled by motives other than the concern for the revival and survival of European culture. Real politicians, who but a short while ago dreamed of the pastoralization of the heart of the continent, are now concerned with reviving German industry, primarily because they wish to erect a European bulwark against the onrush of the Russian state power. Jünger, when he wrote the piece, didn't think in these categories. He wrote as a European, who with all the fibers of his being was tied to the rediscovered European humanist tradition, worried lest this tradition be buried in the maddening rush of competing and quarreling nationalisms, in the irrational hatreds that the war would leave in its wake. The piece is the fruit of an agonized self-search, the passionate reappraisal of his own and Germany's past, by a man who, after the trials and turmoils and hatreds of Germany's interwar years, has arrived at conclusions which basically contradict his earlier beliefs in the virtues of the national state and the heroic sacrifice in war. To have peace, it is not enough not to wish for war. True peace postulates courage of a higher order than that which war demands. It is a product of spiritual travail, of spiritual strength. It is attained when we learn to extinguish the red fires within us, and to free our own hearts from hate and its disruptive power. These means which Jünger outlines for the achievement of peace are certainly not sufficient to arrive at that rational control of politics which is in tune with the demands of a new international morality. However, those who will read this little volume will find in it an incentive to overcome those hatreds, those prejudices that add so much to create the atmosphere of impending doom under which we all labor today. Louis Clare, New York City, March 5th, 1948. Part 1. The Seed. The hatred, which is completely conquered by love, becomes love, and such love is then stronger than if hatred had not preceded it. Spinoza, Ethics, 44th Theorem. 1. Surely never before was so great a responsibility laid upon a generation of men and on its thinkers and leaders as now, when the war is drawing to its end. Certainly our history has never been lacking in grave and momentous decisions, but never did the fate of such a multitude depend upon them. Each inhabitant of this planet will be affected by them for weal or for woe, and not only he, but his remote descendants also. It may safely be said that this war has been humanity's first joint effort. The peace that ends it must be the second. The builders who fashion peace out of chaos must not only test and improve the old structures, but also create new ones towering above and uniting them. On these men it depends whether good spirits will guard the new house, and whether mankind can live in it in freedom and happiness, or whether prisons and cells for martyrs are again to be hidden in its foundations as sources of corruption. If the peace is to bring blessings for all, it must rest upon simple and common foundations. It cannot be limited to a political or, even in the best sense of the word, to a spiritual product, but must at the same time be the creation of good and generous forces. Expressed in terms of logic, it aims at basic principles. In terms of theology, at a formula of salvation. What then must be this way of salvation that is to guide our thoughts? This, that the war must bear fruit for each of us. 2. If, then, the war must bear fruit for all, we must first seek the seed from which such a harvest can grow. It cannot spring from all the forces of separation, from the persecution, the hatred, and injustices of our times. That is the evil seed which has been all too freely sown, and whose last traces must be rooted out. The true fruit can come forth only from mankind's common fund of good, from its soundest core, from its noblest, most unselfish stock. It is to be sought where, without thought for himself and his own weal, man lives and dies for others and sacrifices himself for them. And that has happened abundantly. A great treasure of sacrifice has been gathered as a basis for the rebuilding of the world. The sacrifice, and this everyone must have felt, lay in the unreserved effort of the most lowly and simple. Affairs had taken a driving and evil course to which there contributed the missed opportunities and errors not of the living only, but of many generations. They drove on towards the fire. In fire they wished to be refined and purified. Then even those most firmly resolved yet to direct things to a good end found themselves pushed to the edge. Now, for the unnumbered and unnamed, one thing alone remained: to shoulder their burden honorably at the post where fate had placed them. And in the memory of furthest ages, this great spectacle will remain. How in every land, when the hour had come, they went out to battle on the frontiers, to sea fights on the oceans, to deadly encounters of squadrons in the air. Then in every people and in every army there were deeds of wonder and despair, and long-established fame in arms acquired its meed of new laurels. In this battle of giants, each opponent could be proud of the other, and to the extent that time tempers enmity, the secret request and even the secret love between conqueror and conquered will grow. The one gains meaning from the other. Behind the bloody battle lines, which for the first time welded the earth's ball with glowing bands, stretched the grey, lightless depths of the army of workers. In them the greatest sum of human endeavor was produced that men have ever harnessed to one end. In fullness of gratitude and of emotion, one must remember these men and women, their laborious days in gloomy workshops, their night watches in the darkened towns, and their long hours of work with hearts filled with care for brothers, sons, and children. There is no reckoning those who died thus, worn out with overwork, bowed down with burdens and care, snuffed out like nameless lights. The good seed that was there, ground down, must not be lost. It must for long furnish us with bread. That will come about only if we grasp the true and hidden significance of their labor and sacrifice. It is not that they fashion the instruments of death and destruction, the weapons for killing, for sinking ships, for destroying city after city. Deep in their hearts there lived instead a sense of true generosity, true sacrifice, which flowers and bears fruit more richly than in the world of hate. Under a just peace, then, we must unite what has flowed from separate but pure sources. Through reason we must give reality to something that existed as a vague force in the aspirations of unnumbered millions, whatever the land in which they chanced to be born, a greater and better rule of peace. 3. When we review the sacrifice, we must not forget those who were plunged into the depths of pure sorrow, of pure suffering. The times lay upon the weak and innocent with the weight of iron. Who knows the hosts of those who died from hunger, disease, exhaustion, from lack of care and medicaments? And those other hosts destroyed when the towns were laid in ruins, who fell beneath the wreckage of their houses, who drowned in the cellars, who suffocated or were consumed by liquid phosphorus. The line of women, children, and aged who vanished thus is endless. Untold numbers had their days cut short, as many again were never to know what life is. The young grew up in hells, in realms fit rather for the habitation of demons than of men, and the children gained their first images from a world of terror. They heard the howling of the sirens before the peal of the bells, and their cradle was nearer the fire than the light. We must think, too, of those who went down with the ships, who drowned in the solitude of the seas, who froze in the icy waters, or whom death overcame in scalding steam, in the flare of the explosion, in the rings of burning oil spreading wide round their boats. In those days darkness lay over the paths of the sea. Yet even the soldier had to bear burdens far exceeding those of his calling, and those befitting opponents within the Christian community. This can be grasped only by those who conceive of the struggle not as a trial of arms between peoples and states, between nations and races, but rather as a universal civil war which split the world into mysterious, all the more terrible forms. This explains why, in the course of these fateful years, engagements were to take place, which were far more terrible than the battles of materiel and fire of the First World War. For the man who believes he fights for ideas and ideals is possessed by greater ruthlessness than he who merely defends his country's frontiers. So battles were made possible in which even the defeated, the unarmed, could not count on mercy. Encirclement and captivity which offered no prospect of escape. Over wide plains and fields, the terrors of the elements vied with a technology of murder and unshakable cruelty. There were areas where men destroyed each other like vermin, and broad woods in which to hunt men like wolves. And one saw, cut off from all hope as if on a dead star, great armies go to their death in the horror chambers of the pocket battles. Numberless were those who experienced the bitterness of dying in beleaguered outposts where one sees death approaching inexorably from afar. Happy could be he who recognized the real enemy in his opponent and could fall before doubt awoke in his breast. Yet many, and they, the best, bravest, and wisest, saw themselves marked down for destruction, unable to yield themselves to the magic of the flags and symbols under whose influence they were doomed to give their lives. For it was these who could not escape the thought that they were in a battle for higher things than the frontiers of the fatherland, that in this fratricidal war a new purpose was being born to the earth, and that many of those on the other side, whose approach meant death, were closer to the higher goal than the comrades at one side. Yet with them one had to keep faith. So, above all, for the true and pure of heart, the war entered the realms of tragedy, and to an upright mind, the contradiction between the voices of future and past, between the world and one's native land, between duty and intuition, seemed insoluble. There were many to whom death in the open field, in honorable combat, seemed the only, the best solution. With them the best, full seed fell into the ground. 4. Even more somber becomes the picture of suffering, in those places where the world was turned into a mere slaughterhouse, to a flaying house whose stench poisoned the air far and wide. In the forcing house of war and civil war, the great theories of the past century bore fruit as they were applied in practice. Now it became clear that irrespective of whether they heralded the equality or inequality of man, they had invented cold-blooded reasoning. The yardstick of theory was applied to individuals, to races, to peoples. As always, in such cases, the thirst for blood soon passed all measure, once the first victim had fallen. So, in the senseless interplay of force and terror, persecution and injustice broke over wide and ever-growing expanses of the globe. Soon the last free voices had to keep silence, and even the sounds of terror died away in the terrible stillness which surrounded prison and cemetery. Only dark rumors hinted at the gruesome revels, where police and torturers feasted on the humiliation, on the blood of their victims. For distant ages these will remain our century's blot of shame. No one will be respected whose heart and eyes were insensible to what happened there. This is above all true for the military youth, for the protection of the weak and helpless will always remain the highest flower of knighthood. No one can be a hero before the enemy whom this flower does not adorn. From the Far East to the Hesperides, from the South to the White Sea, we learned what burdens and sorrows men bore in lands where terror was the highest law. Wars brought it in their dark train, no less than civil wars, and under the domination of classes, parties, or foreign armies, only the aims altered, never the unchanging face of tyranny. And as in great conflagrations, now one wind and now another feeds the flames, there were lands where white and red terror alternated, and where the victims fell now under the blows of native despots, now under those of a foreign power. So violence raged like a plague, whose germs continually inflame new hate, and, spreading by many roots, strike always at the poor and weak. And however the ideas may be disguised, in whose name heads are called for, the great mass graves are all the same. Such too was the fate of innumerable nameless men who clung to lost outposts until their hour of terror struck. The doomed member of the resistance faced the omnipotence of the executioner, and the way to the peaks of suffering had many stations. Particularly terrifying were the cold mechanics of persecution, the considered technique of decimation, the tracking and surveillance of the victims by means of the lists and files of a police force which swelled into armies. It seemed as if every method, every discovery of the human mind had been transformed into an instrument of oppression. Thus years and decades of terror broke upon countless families. House and cottage lay defenseless at the mercy of class and racial hatred, of unconcealed despotism, and even of naked bestiality. And this spreading gloom was not confined to the limits of the continent, but penetrated into lands which for centuries had been distinguished by legal knowledge in the exercise of justice, lands where, from ancient times, freedom had found as good a dwelling as it may have among men. But now the mist came down, bringing with it the silence of the oppressed, over whose helplessness the tyrants triumphed with wild, unbridled glee. Things lost their cheerful hue, and with each new morning came the question, would evening find the family united round the table, or torn apart, its members dragged away? And when at night the light was extinguished, the ear strained to catch the whispering of the police agents without, waited for the door to resound with blows as a sign that the hunters had tracked down their prey. These were years when even the prisons no longer sufficed. and in which multitudes, dragged off illegally and without sentence, languished in dungeons where death was the only kindness. Many were seized on the steps of the court which had just acquitted them. The camps filled too, where forced labor ceased only with annihilation, thus achieving its deliberate aim. Anyone who there wasted away had long been dead to his kin, for the precautions designed by warped minds saw to it that no sign of life came from the torture cells. And more obscure, more gruesome than ever before was the death the executioners prepared for the innocent after they had broken up the families and robbed them of possessions and liberty. The secrecy, the shunning of the light, the slaughterings in cellars and evil places, and the hasty, unceremonious burial of the victims showed only too clearly that here was no execution of just sentence, but mere outrage and wanton murder. The number of Golgothas where the disenfranchised were slaughtered is enormous. The crime of which the unfortunates were accused was merely that of existing, the stigma of their birth. They fell because they were sons of their people, of their fathers, of their race, as hostages, as adherents of a disinherited creed, as disseminators of their faith, which laws invented overnight had decreed to be a mortal taint. From out of this waste of suffering there rise somberly the names of the great seats of murder, where in a last and final frenzy they attempted to root out whole peoples, whole races, whole classes, and where leaden tyranny in league with technical efficiency celebrated endless bloody nuptials. These dens of murder will haunt man's memory to the end of time. They are the true monuments of this war, as once before were Douaumont or Longemarck. But those were names which could mingle pride with suffering. Here only sorrow and humiliation remain, for the desecration was such that it touched the whole human race, and no man can free himself from complicity. That was where progress led with its theories and ideas. Into these swamps emptied an all too clever, inventive age. If ever new pride fills us at the length and boldness of our flight, at our intellectual wings, our pinions of steel, it should suffice to cure us for a glance to be cast on the hordes driven like cattle to the graveyards and cremation ovens, where the executioners waited. There they were stripped of their rags and slaughtered like shorn sheep. They were forced even to dig their own graves, if their murderers did not fill quarries and pit shafts with the corpses which piled up too fast. These scenes of horror, of which dark rumors pass from mouth to mouth, will be brought to light only when the lost souls who played the hangman there, together with their superiors, are forced to break silence before the courts. Yet when we look upon these places of martyrdom, let us do so frankly and with clear judgment. It was the evil spirit of the rabble which there in darkness practiced its grisly arts. Then we saw the feigned indignation of other evil forces which came to the haunts of infamy, to exhume the hastily buried victims and expose the wasted corpses, to measure, count, and reproduce them as served their ends. They played the accusers only to acquire the right to still baser vengeance, which they sated in similar orgies. Thus one massacre was succeeded by another baser still, but the hand that would help mankind and lead it out of its follies must be unstained by crime or deeds of violence. 5. The realm of suffering has a strict hierarchy with ranks, branches, and gradations by which man descends. It is here that he seeks the sources of life, and as springs flow into lakes and thence into seas, so sorrows gather in ever larger volume and in greater purity. Just as for thoughts there is consciousness, so for sufferings there are modes in which they become rational and unite to acquire a deeper meaning. Therefore, through these years, the suffering of the man of the spirit has been great. Far more than by his own persecution, he was sickened by the spectacle of baseness gaining the mastery. It was not wars or dangers that caused him to fear, but the blind urge which drove the masses, at first in wild exultation, and then in a passion of hatred and revenge, along unknown paths which soon led to the flames. He also saw, sooner and more clearly, how man's high sense of duty was perverted, how labor and science turned to the service of death, how the sword shielded injustice, how the judge, under the crude disguise of ceremony, debased justice into a tool of the courts, how the teacher destroyed the divine image in the children instead of illumining it, and how doctors, instead of healing, maimed the weak and killed the sick. He saw the machine arise to domination in cold structures, which a titanic will forced up overnight as palaces of destruction and Babylonian confusion. All too soon they were to be seen rising like spectral skeletons from the scorched earth to herald the triumph of death. In the same way one builds into a bridge the demolition chambers for blowing it up. He was therefore less affected by the collapse of scaffoldings and facades than by the loss of old heritage, of well-formed things handed down and irreplaceable. With each conflagration he saw the world grow poorer, and jewel after jewel fall from its crown and adornment of intellectual splendor. He saw the old guilt mingle with new, justice and injustice so entwined that there had to come a purification by fire. Like a lofty mirror reflecting images and figures, his spirit endured and shared in silence the flames and sufferings of the blazing world. Once more, and that in the lowest pit of all, these sorrows were finally reproduced in the mothers. In all lands their suffering was one and the same. Like Niobe, they saw their children die from the keen arrows fate shot out of the unknown. Multitudes had thus to give their most beloved, and with each month the great struggle lasted, a lamentation swelled that will not die away for years and scores of years to come. 6. The second round of this great struggle, which has its roots in the rise of a new order, a new unity, was harder, more demanding, more merciless than the first. Yet that had seemed unsurpassable in violence and scope. The cause is not to be sought in a divergence of the people's aims during the brief truce. On the contrary, their goals grew closer, fusing at the focal point where a new character takes shape, the character of work, which sets its stamp upon the peoples and conceals their differences. Therefore, it is no longer national aims which are in question, but the aim of the war itself. For this reason, the suffering pierced deeper, harrowed the hearts more. For to the horrors of war were added those of fratricidal strife, of civil war, which are more horrible still. In their train come yet greater perils, and here one saw many draw back who had proved their valor on the field of battle. Therefore, the figure symbolizing the second war of nations will have deeper origins than that of the first. Then it was unknown soldier to whom monuments were raised in the heart of every capital, as a sign that the great treasure of suffering he had gathered in the fire should, henceforth, be the center of the nation, warming and shedding light, just as the hearth is the center of the home. And in fact an image did arise for the nations with power to form and unite in an age poor in true vitality. But this time the suffering was more widely spread, more obscure and complex. It reached deeper into the realms of motherhood. It was closer to the great religious images. For that reason it will form the base for structures towering higher into the light. Just as the sacrifice embodied in the unknown soldier inspired the peoples, so the new sacrifice will shed its influence and creative power far over the frontiers between the nations. Later, when the fighting has died down, people will understand that reason could recognize the new ways of life and strive towards them, but that for their creation there was required the combined effort of passions, suffering, and the fire. The complexities of the fronts concealed from those who were active and those who suffered, the unity of the great work under whose spell they played their parts. Yet through their creative power, through the transformation into sacrifice, it will become evident. Thus, by falling, they become the good seed, which will bear fruit 100-fold.